Good morning, everyone. We will be starting promptly at 10:30. So good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Strub, and I'm the Vice President of Communications for Infrastructure Resources. I'd like to welcome you to the Excavation Safety Alliance Town Hall, which is hosted by IR. And our topic today is PHMSA and NTSB recommendations for tolerant zones. Does one size fit all? Our ESA town halls are an open forum to discuss concerns and present potential solutions to improve damage prevention and excavation safety. A recording of this town hall will be posted on the Excavation Safety Alliance website, along with a brief blog post. We will also post the chat log, so if you do not want your comment or name included, please note that with your post. If you have a question during the town hall, please type it into the chat box or click the raise hand icon. Give us a few seconds and we will give you permission to unmute yourself. To unmute, simply click on the microphone icon in the top right corner of your screen. Today's meeting is meant to be a discussion, and you're all encouraged to ask questions and share solutions. Please try to keep your comments brief to allow others time to interact. We will wrap up around 11:30 Central, but may continue the conversation with coffee and questions after a brief survey. Now I will let Ed introduce himself and our panelists.
Hi, Karen, and I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined this afternoon. Looks like we have, 80 plus on the meeting, so great attendance. I appreciate the interest, and, I want to be able to set the stage a bit and then have that discussion so we can understand, have a greater understanding of tolerance zones and what they mean to different stakeholder groups. So with that, I would like to allow our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start off with my good friend, Devin.
Good morning. My name is Devin Carlock. I'm the Vice President of Safety and Government Relations for Cottrell Contracting. I'm also the President of the Council for Dredging and Marine Construction Safety.
Thank you, Devin. How about you, Sam?
Thanks, Ed, and a pleasure to be with you all this morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. My name is Sam Menifee, and I'm a policy advisor at the American Petroleum Institute. I work in our midstream department, and I'm the staff lead for our damage prevention work group and our public engagement and awareness group.
Thank you, Sam. Paco.
Hey, good morning, folks. Paco Alvarez, damage prevention coordinator for Chevron Pipeline and Power. Also in charge of the public awareness program for Chevron. Former line locator from Los Angeles, now out here in Houston, Texas, supporting the business here for Chevron Pipeline. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So again, I'm going to just talk a few minutes to set the stage here. And as we know, tolerance zones in all types of excavation, no matter whether it's on land or in marine environments, really have a place in safety to understand what tolerance zones mean, understand the requirements and why tolerance zones exist. And specifically, when we get down into the marine environments, utilities across lakes, bays, waterways, the Gulf or oceans in the Pacific or Atlantic, tolerance zones in many different areas, again, even on land, can mean different things to different folks. There are different types of laws in different states, nuances from one state to the next that may define tolerance zones differently. And I wanted to take a moment, many of us on the call are familiar with the CGA best practices. And although tolerance zone is mentioned in there multiple times, in 5.19, there's one around excavation tolerance zones. And I'd like to read that to folks. And so the practice statement is: the excavator observes a tolerance zone that is comprised of the width of the facility plus 18 inches on on either side of the outside edge of the underground facility on a horizontal plane. This practice is not intended to preempt any existing state provincial requirements that are currently specify a tolerance zone of more than 18 inches. So again, that's not a law per se, although in CGA's eyes, but there are laws in many states that reference that 18-inch tolerance zone requirement. So there also are some differences around marking facilities. So for whoever the owner operator is a facility, to be able to, the requirement to mark accurately and mark within 18 inches of that facility. So as we try and to look at consistency, and goes to the heart of this meeting of quote unquote, does one size fit all? You know, the questions that are driven due to some recent accidents are, you know, does this apply to those utilities, whatever it is, that cross waterways, right? And so I think that with some recent accidents, there has been a drive to actually look at different types of activities and specify tolerance zone for those activities, specifically around dredging. And again, under setting the stage a little bit here, after the Corpus Christi fatality incident where 6 people lost their lives, the NTSB in their recommendations recommended looking at tolerance zones and what that means. And so that's forced us as an industry in the utilities and pipeline specifically to go back and look at those tolerance zones and see if quote unquote one size fits all. And I'll close by saying, before we get into some questions for the panelists and get their perspectives, one of the things from the NTSB recommendation was around targeting a dredge tolerance zone. And so PHMSA has sent out a questionnaire to all of their states. I think it's 50 states plus maybe it's Puerto Rico, et cetera. I think there's a total of 52 areas that they oversee. But those 2 questions are as follows. This was sent again to the regulatory and one-call authorities in each state, right, that PHMSA regulates. And PHMSA, for those mariners on the phone, is the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, and they are basically the pipeline regulator at a federal level. And then when you drop down into the individual states, the individual states have their own regulatory authority. And this starts to divide a bit. If I can digress here for a second, this starts to divide a little bit different nuances in state laws from one state to the next and how those look. I will, for folks on the phone, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, we have no state one-call law. No federal one-call law, so we don't have any type of all-encompassing federal regulation around one call, around line marking, around tolerance zones, and many other areas. Hence, does one size fit all, right? So excavators, when they travel from one state to another, whether you're on land or a marine excavator, there are different nuances with 811 laws and excavation requirements that they need to follow. And so because we don't have a federal quote one call law or excavation laws, that leaves out federally areas under federal jurisdictions like waterways. So if you're in the Gulf of Mexico, Pacific or Atlantic, once you get outside of that state's territorial boundaries, there is no law that says that you have to either have a damage prevention program, that you have to have, that you have to call 811 or make a notification. So just note that. Again, so going back to the questions that PHMSA sent to each state, and I'll quote and then we'll open it up, is first question sent to each state was, is dredging included in the state's definition of excavation? Yes, no. If yes, specifically call out the definition and explain how dredging is included in the statute. That's question one. Question two is, has the state established a tolerant zone for dredging? If so, what is it? Indicate either yes, no, and provide details. So this has driven questions, that have come back to us of, okay, so what do we need to do about tolerant zones? Because obviously this question is being asked of us. And as far as I know, there is no state that has a tolerant zone for, dredging, much less any other types of marine construction. So I think that we'll hear from our panelists that some of the laws that exist now and best practices may not be one size fits all, but really the key is, if we agree that it doesn't, is there the ability to change or be able to work on that type of tolerant zone that might be more inclusive, and what would that look like? Okay, so hopefully I did some setting the stage there, and so I would like to ask a few questions and get some perspectives from our panelists. Really, I'm going to open this up to all three, but Devin, since you're an industry contractor, especially, I know that you probably do both on land and marine type work in your different areas. I know you do dredging specifically, but in those spoil areas where you may take the material, may traverse to on land type activity. But so what does tolerant zones, in your perspective and in your industry, what does that mean to you?
Well, thank you, Ed. And tolerance zones for our industry, right now, like you said, there's no specific tolerance zones in subaquatic, dredging. While you're dredging, they are basically self-implied, or we have to monitor and feel where we feel comfortable to coming near a pipeline, skipping over the pipeline and then moving ahead. There's a lot of risk in that, and I think you're going to touch on this later on as far as that risk factor. But on land, we have very specific areas, like you said, whether 18 or job specific for marking of those pipelines or utilities. As the moment that it goes into the waterway, all bets are off, because there's many different elements when you speak about currents and what that pipeline is doing, if you don't have an accurate survey or knowing exactly where that pipeline, because our experience has shown us that these pipelines move over time. They do shift with currents on occasion, and so we need to have the exact data on where this is located, so we can establish a safe tolerance zone. But it would be from a case-to-case basis.
Yep, thank you. So Paco, for with your experience and being a line locator, can you explain to folks, your opinion on the difference between tolerant zone for marking and tolerant zone for excavating?
Right. So, I guess let's start for locating, right? And it all starts with the training, from your line locators, right? What are they looking for? as far as you know, the magnetic field and whatnot, you know, and it differs from, you know, onshore to offshore, just like you're saying, right? And Devin covered all the tolerance zones really well there. But you know, that, you know, for us, you know, it's, you know, they say, okay, an 18-inch tolerance zone when you're marking. For us, we want to be dead on our line, right? As close as possible. So any forms, any way of verifying where a pipeline's at, whether it be using a probe, using, you know, some PVC out in the water crossings there, anything that could get us right where our pipeline's at, that's what we're gonna do. Now, you know, very important, right? It's, you know, there isn't anything that's standard out there right now. So just like Dan was saying is, you know, what type of dredging is going to be going on, right? What size of vessel is going to be crossing our pipelines? You know, it brings in that importance of the communication and collaborating with the dredger, excavator, you know, and that pre-communication and planning for the job. So, you know, just like you were saying that, you know, we're looking at these new best practices and all that. So I think really that pre-planning and you know, leading up to the jobs is going to be really important, right? Especially with that tolerance zone, you know, standardizing that and making sure that everybody's on the same page with that is going to be really important.
Yep. Thank you, Paco. So Sam, if there was an initiative out there to either enhance tolerance zones or that communication or, you know, education, you know, I know that there was a lot of great work done with the recommended practices around public awareness and damage prevention put out by API that's almost adopted universally. Is there some opportunities there that you might see and maybe even go back and maybe explain the process on how things get to be a recommended practice if there's a drive to go that way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Ed. And you mentioned and Paco mentioned as well, this patchwork of state regulations. And I can only imagine how difficult it is for the mariners working in one ship channel and you cross, you know, state line in the water, and now you're working in a different state with a different set of regulations. And so I think the need for a consistent and standard approach to tolerance zones, or at least one that that parses out the difference between on land and marine environments, is really needed. And one method of achieving that kind of consistent approach to tolerance zone is through a recommended practice or a standard published by API. API was formed in 1919 and then adopted the standards development part of its organization in 1924. So we have a long history of developing standards, recommended practices for the industry. Currently, there are over 800 standards across the oil and gas industry, and they're developed through the API American National Standards Institute, ANSI, accredited process, which provides both that third-party rigor as well as technical accreditation for these standards and best practices. They're developed through a consensus-based process that includes federal and state regulators, expert members of the public, academic experts and nonprofit experts, pipeline operators, and with a standard like this, certainly dredgers and marine construction operators as well. When we develop a recommended practice like one perhaps on tolerance zones, it's you get all the folks together in a room and you develop it through that consensus-based process. So it's not necessarily everyone gets what they want, but you're working through negotiations between the different stakeholders to make sure you publish a document that really improves safety down the line. Ed, you mentioned 1162. That's our recommended practice on pipeline public awareness. And I think that's one that certainly improves and helps move the ball down the field to improve safety for pipeline operators. Another one I'll mention is RP 1173. That's on pipeline safety management systems. But those are just a few examples as if we did want to move down the road of a recommended practice, API is a great vehicle to do so. And we, throughout this process, working with Devin and Ed, have have offered the services of API to do a recommended practice. The one caveat I would say, as someone mentioned, it does take some time. It can be a several years long process. So while we certainly have offered these services, we want to make sure that if something is needed a little bit more time sensitive, we can move that rock as well. So I hope that provides a little bit of background on the RP process, as well as the potential for a tolerance zone document either now or in the future to help improve safety.
Yep. Very good. Thank you, Sam. And going back to the PHMSA questions, again, these were the first time, per NTSB recommendations, that these questions have ever been asked of the states, around is dredging included in your definition of excavation, and do you have a tolerance zone around there? So I would have liked to seen a little bit more encompassing approach, specifically after talking with other types of marine stakeholders and pipeline companies alike, to where it's a little bit more inclusive of marine excavation rather than just targeting dredging. So I think there's an opportunity there as well. And so I just want to make sure that, if people on the call have seen these questions, I would probably just recommend that, it be a little bit more inclusive, because there is other types of work out there besides dredging. So again, Sam, thank you. Hey, Devin, maybe I'd like to go back to you. So
Sure.
So what's some of could you talk a little bit about your projects and some of the risk, or I hate to use the L word, the liability word, that you incur, right, as a dredger? Because at the end of the day, your people are the ones who are most likely to come in contact with a facility. And also, as we go through the conversation, don't forget about, there's a huge fiber build out, right, happening now throughout the US. And these fiber lines I've already, going through waterways, along with there's wind energy being offshore, et cetera, that's going through these waterways. So, much like we've seen on land, those waterways, no matter where you are also becoming more challenging. But Devin, I'd like to go back to you, and if
Sure.
you can talk about some of the risk that you would like to see lessened in your business, and why.
So, thank you, Ed. We face a clear danger every day when we're dredging, and all of the risk is on our crews and for our crews. Without accurate pipeline marking, Ed, you mentioned surveying and how we can improve that, but the current system is such that we have a project to do. They say, here you go. One of our largest customers is the Army Corps of Engineers, and they lay out and they mark these pipelines and these crossings. Now it's up to us on how close that we can get to these pipelines, and we're speaking about large pieces of equipment. Dredges range from cutters and buckets that are very small, from maybe 2 to 3 feet, to ones that are over 6 feet, and big machines like over 200 or 300 feet long, with large spuds. And spuds, for those on the call who aren't aware, these are the anchors that hold us to the sea floor so we can hydraulically dredge and mechanically dredge. We need to have a firm hold on the seafloor so we can pick up the material and then either place it into a barge or move the pipeline or move the material via pipeline. But all of that risk is on us. And on each one of these incidents, dredgers have died because of it. And what we're trying to do, not only, Ed, you and I have been, hitting this hard over the past several years at the CDMCS Pipeline Task Force, and it's trying to get awareness and also bring the core in, because that's the key, right? When your customer is saying that you need to dredge from point A to point B, but we have some gas lines and we have some oil pipelines. How do we know where those exactly where those pipelines are? And let's include utilities. Now, you call 811 central call. What happens? Well, sir, where's the closest intersection? You know, we've talked about this before. Ma'am, I'm not, or sir, I'm not working in an intersection. I'm working on the water. Well, I need the closest intersection. So how do we solve this? We have a standardization, right? We go national. We have each of these call 811 centers that have a marine specialty person that's educated, that's aware of what we do. That's going to raise awareness on their end, and they say, wow, okay, I didn't realize that. I understand better now. Send them a set of the plans. So again, this is how we start the conversation and how we move forward on this. You know, and as far as marking, Ed, do you want me to go into like how we do our surveys or what the tools are out there, or we want to save that a little bit?
I tell you what, why don't you save that a little bit?
Okay.
I'd like for Paco to maybe respond. You know, so Paco, in most states, right? Before we kind of get to the tolerance zone issue, you know, Devin brought up that notification or that call needs to be made. In most states, that is, you know, 2 to 3 business days. So isn't that, you know, almost impossible to get some kind of marine boat and survey crew out? And you know, so what's the challenges there?
Yeah, Ed, you know, you're 100% correct there. It's, you know, 2 to 3 days. You know, if you're looking at, you know, especially thinking about the Gulf out here, right, where we have some of our assets, you know, you think about the weather out there, you know, it's, especially when you get into hurricane season, you have those challenges, you know, and then, you know, making sure that, you know, there is, you do get that information before you go out there and mark it out, right? You know, potentially being able to meet with the dredger out, you know, being able to schedule all that 2 to 3 days, you know, the you know, folks are going to be doing that work. They have their ongoing work that's going on, you know, like Devin and his team, right? So 2 to 3 days is not realistic. You know, even on land, when you think about it, 2 to 3 days, sometimes it's a challenge because, you know, you may be driving, you know, 2-3 hours to go and mark a pipeline. And plus you got, you know, all your other projects that are going on. So, you know, it's really, you know, standardizing the pre-planning is really how we're able to do this, and you know, looking at those one call tickets, right, or dredging tickets, whatever, you know, we have and end up calling them in the future, is making sure that those are submitted once both parties have all the information that they need, you know, and we need to you know, change that process. So yeah, you know, does one call process fit all? Definitely not, you know, especially now when it comes to that water. And you know, that's why I'm glad that, you know, the collaboration that we have between all our groups is at the end of the day, you know, we want everybody to go home safe. So let's get everybody on board and make sure that that's what our ultimate goal is at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, I would just add that, you know, hey, I think that everyone agrees that safety of our lives and livelihood is number one, right? And then, you know, close second is the utilities that power our community, you know, outages either from, you know, again, those electrical crossings, fiber lines that build out. And so, you know, there are definitely challenges. So Paco, you raise a good point. Maybe it's just not maybe it's even bigger than just tolerance zones, right? And, so maybe it's more of the whole process. Devin brought it up, the challenges with trying to make a one call, and then trying to mark and then try to abide by those tolerance zone areas. This might be a controversial statement, but the way I appreciate it, and I know we have some one call experts on the line that I would definitely like to hear from, but I think in state laws that different state laws, if you go out and mark a utility or facility, it has to be marked within 18 inches of the facility by law. And if that's the case, that's almost impossible to do in a lake or a waterway, much less the Gulf of Mexico. Sam, industry trends, as far as safety and as it applies to some of this, what do you have some comments you can kind of help us out from I know you work a lot with government and industry. And so what are some perspectives on this that you can further add?
Yeah, great question. And, one of the hats that I wear within API is working on our annual performance report that gathers all the data around liquid transmission pipelines and publishes those. And while we're seeing an overall trend of total incidents going down, particularly incidents impacting people, the environment, those are the ones out in the right of way that would have an impact on people or property damage or the environment. Those are going down as well, something in the order of 30% over the last 5 years. Despite that good message and the trend of total incidents going down, despite our build out of pipeline infrastructure, we're still seeing excavation incidents, and we're still seeing excavation incidents as one of the leading causes of fatalities, injuries, property damage. So while they are high in number, they're also very high in consequence. They also lead to these very high consequence incidents, which can have a real impact both on people, employees, but also, as you mentioned, on service delivery. We're now in the kind of place after the passage of the the Inflation Reduction Act, where we're going to see a lot more build out of low carbon energy infrastructure pipelines in the near future as well. Pipelines transporting carbon dioxide, hydrogen, for CCUS. We talked a little bit about the wind offshore build out as well. We're going to see more and more pipelines being built, not fewer and fewer. And so it is in all of our best interest to make sure we're doing this in the safest way possible. The trend overall is going in the right direction. We're seeing incidents go down, but we want to make sure that those trends for excavation incidents continue to go down as well. Paco mentioned a couple tools that we have, and I think a couple things in particular stand out to me. One are those design and planning tickets, and trying to make sure we can place a design planning ticket ahead of schedule. That's not going to get us into the, you have to respond and market it in 2 to 3 days, but that just starts the conversation between a dredger and a pipeline operator. The second one is awareness for pipeline operators of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project database. That's one thing that we talked about in some of our meetings last week as a damage prevention group, but the Corps manages and maintains a list of all of their awards and proposals by location and by scope, so a pipeline operator can see, hey, I know that there's work that's going to be conducted in this area, and here's the scope of it. And it may not tell me the exact the winner of the bid, but I can at least figure out the timing, the scope, and the location of some of that work, so I can get ahead of this a little bit. I can start preempting these discussions a little bit instead of just waiting for the ticket to come in and then having to rush through that process. And then the third one, I think, is the National Pipeline Mapping System. That's a free NPMS is a free system that's managed by PHMSA, and it is kind of twofold. There's a public viewer which provides the location of pipelines fairly exact, but then there's also what they call PHMSA, which is for excavators, public officials. You can sign on, create an account, and you can get the exact location of some of these pipelines, what they're carrying, what the pressure is, the commodities. So a dredger can start figuring out, hey, I know I have some lines in this area. I need to be proactive too. Maybe I need to figure out who the operator is and start engaging them a little early on in the process. The operator then can say, I know that there's work being done in this region thanks to the Army Corps list. I know that there's a design ticket placed by the dredger. I need to be proactive and start having this conversation early as well. So I think, you know, the trend's going in the right way, but we want to continue working. We realize that there's a whole lot more work to do on the excavation side.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Sam. So I'm going to make a few comments, and then I'd like to go to the chat. And Karen, if you would help me with some the team with questions in the chat, I would appreciate it. The ones that I know you're monitoring so that way if we've answered some things that we're not redundant. But so I definitely want to open it up. But so I will say that you know, there have been advances made in making one calls, and specifically as we get awareness out about making an online ticket where you can actually draw in a tolerance zone versus a in-person call. You know, Devin may help alleviate that, but I think our industry, you know, needs to do better at training those type of stakeholders to use that online ticket process where they can draw in their work scope and maybe bypass, you know, some way of that, you know, education gap with the people who you might get when you physically dial 811. So there might be some, you know, opportunities there. And before I go to the chat, I would like to make note of an incident that I worked on. You know, it wasn't really an incident, but it was took a lot of coordination in Iowa, of all places, a landlocked state. Somebody had a dredger had, you know, been contracted by a community to go in and deepen a lake in Iowa. So that way it would hold more water, that holding more water in those lakes in the dry season, they could irrigate fields, etc., and also have community that lives around the lake, right? So the dredger, you know, took apart the dredge, trucked up his excavation equipment, and this wasn't just a dredge, it was other type of excavation equipment that was on a barge, you know, regular excavate, you know. And I want to say also that normal on-land excavators are used in marine environments. Many times I see those for marine construction put on a barge and use that bucket to actually, you know, do shallow water type work, drive pilings, etc., for boat docks, ramps, other types of infrastructure. But back to this story, the dredger did his job, made a one call. The utility marked to the edge of the lake on each side and said, you know, dredger said, golly, I need more information than this. This lake is you know, almost 1,000 feet wide. I can't line up those marks, you know, and the utility didn't have the ability to go mark the line. And you know, dredger was saying, you know, I'm trying to adhere to the law, but at the end of the day, you know, if I can't get something marked, how can I excavate safely around it? So it really became a little bit of a tug of war. I told him that in his excavation site, that when he draws his polygon, that he only needs to include just the waterway, don't include the landmass. I said, because that way that's your documentation that you did make a mark with only within the waterway, but it was not able to be marked into that area, you know. So and they finally, you know, worked with the utility, was not a pipeline company, but finally worked with the utility, and they gave them enough data, you know. Hey, I know it, you know, and I'll close with this again. I hate to be a little bit controversial here, but if you're going to put a utility through a waterway, then you've got to accept the fact that you're, by law, that you're going to have to figure out how to market, right? If you're going to save money from going around the lake or going under a bridge, going over a bridge, whatever you do, it actually, you've got to be able to plan in your line locating plans, which goes to tolerance zones. How am I going to help our friends like Devin out and accurately mark these systems? Okay, so Karen, can I burden you a little bit to ask some questions from the chat?
Absolutely. So Devin, I think this would be best for you, but what is your recommendation when it comes to tolerance zones, inland or subaquatic with abandoned lines?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that, we didn't touch on, was abandoned lines. The identification of the lines, first off, and which way is it running? What is exactly where is that abandoned line? And then from there, a lot of dredging companies have adopted a 50-foot on either side of that pipeline tolerance zone. And that seems to be some have more, like 100. The problem is when you're doing a dredging project, this now leaves what some call a slug or a high spot in your dredging template. We're required to dredge to a certain lead. Let's just say it's 20 feet and the pipeline is at 15. Well, that's a 5-foot elevation change over that pipeline and then back down. And for navigation purposes, you want to be able to have consistent. So that is the challenge.
There's another comment that came in that was eye-opening for me, but it said to remember that dredgers and marine excavators are working in the rough seas and waterways. So you're bouncing around, which can change it by 4. It says by 4 to 5 feet, so the tolerance zone and just what you're looking at can change just with the shift of the water.
Absolutely. We do work out in the elements, having been in, many high seas in my lifetime. It's a large piece of equipment and the waves are big. So when you have that much movement, even though the technology and the hydraulics and everything have improved immensely from years ago, there's still that risk factor that you could potentially go deeper than what's required.
Sure. I'm not sure, Paco, if you'd want to be the one to answer this one, but are land-based signage consistent state to state? And are locates typically stopped at high water? Are there different challenges getting pipeline placing documents per state? I don't know if that ties into your public awareness pieces. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. So land-based signage, so that's standard across the board. When you look at the high, what specific verbiage needs to be on your adhesives or your signage that you have for your facilities and your pipelines, right? So that is standard across the board. And then let me see, what was the second part of that one? I think that was second and a third part, right?
Yeah, are the
I'm trying to look
locates
for that question.
1056, the comment came in from Tony. So are locates typically stopped at high water? And are there different challenges getting pipeline placing documents per state?
So locates, as far as them being stopped at high water, no, I mean, we try to, mark in as many ways as possible, right? Whether it be, buoys or, if it's a simple water crossing, where we're able to have like cane poles or something like that, right? We leave those there, and we'll specify, if there's going to be a crossing, right, of a vessel, it's like, hey, we have these cane poles, and when we'll remove, where we know it's the deepest portion of the pipe, and we'll say, please cross through this opening in this section right here, right? And that's where the communication comes into play. And then let's see here, the last portion was, what was the last one?
The challenge is getting pipeline placing documents per state. So I think that goes to what we've talked about on the pipeline task force of when you're out in the water, what state are you actually working with and who would you talk to get that information? Because even if you're not on a coast, when I was first at the pipeline task force meetings, I thought, okay, coastal states. And then it was no, it's any river or lake. And I'm like, well, now it's everybody. It doesn't, landlocked states are still needing these marine tickets. And so that was one of the pieces that was eye-opening for me. So I think that's what they're talking about, is being out in the water, and who do you go to?
Yeah, that's still a challenge, right? And that's why we have a lot of work ahead of us, through that pipeline task force group. And number one is, getting that feedback from all of the stakeholders, all the folks from doing the marine work, all the folks that have the utilities, they're crossing the waterways and whatnot. And then, real important, Sam's group there, and which is made also collaboratively of folks from our industry, right? Really important, paving, the way of the future. You think about it, some of our children may be working on, some of these dredging, vessels and marking these pipelines. We want to do the best that we could do to make sure that, not only all our folks that are working these days out there safe, but, for the folks that are coming in the future, making sure that, the technologies and the procedures and those one-call tickets, marine tickets are standardized and they fit, the size of the environment and the work that's to be done out there.
We did have some more comments on marine tickets, and I will just ask that the audience holds tight. I think that's something that the pipeline task force, we've broken into 5 different committees, and there are some things that we're working on as far as communications and training, and really pulling the different entities together to open up that conversation and keep that dialogue going. Another question we have is, how do you access the Army Corps of Engineers system for projects?
That's one that I can take. It's on the Army Corps website. I can drop it in the chat, or I can send it to you, Karen. But that's one good method of kind of staying on top of, at a high level. And someone mentioned, the I want to say the inaccuracy, but the high level nature of NPMS, and I'll just second that. If you're getting ready to start a project, NPMS is probably too high level for you. You want something more exact. You want data that's a little bit more accurate. NPMS should just be that first level quick reference. How do I start the conversation? How do I know who's in my area? So I can send that website to you. But I think just overall, I've gained a new sense of appreciation and kind of a new respect for the dredging community. Not that I didn't have it previously, but just understanding and acknowledging the complexity that goes into this work, that you're working in the ocean, in rough seas, in a murky underwater environment sometimes, with utilities and lines that may have been accurate when they were mapped, but that could have been several years or decades ago. And so the litany of moving parts that goes into some of these operations, I think has taken me some time to really appreciate. But I think it's something that, unless you're working in it hands-on, you don't really understand how complex and complicated some of these things are. So I just wanted to add that nuance in there as well.
I would agree completely. I think the pipeline task force, and we'll be having our next meeting in Tampa in February, but I would encourage everybody to come and to share your opinions there and in person, because I didn't know what a SPUD was before these meetings. And as they're looking for the mappings and trying to figure out what they are, and as they're explaining it, once they release it, it's going down. And so if the maps aren't accurate, you're gonna learn. And unfortunately, you're going to learn with a negative result, most likely. So there have been some conversation in the chat, not necessarily questions, but working with SUE, subsurface utility engineering groups, and just the level of planning that should be going into the project. Pre-planning, that damage prevention normally starts a week or 2 before they start. And so I think that that's a good point that's been brought up, is that if you work with the engineers, you could have a much better laid out plan and communicate with all of the entities that would be involved. And we have another one, and this is just an opinion, he says, but I think the majority of facility damage is due to the setback from the pay zone. Is this an accurate version on past facility damages?
So maybe I'll take that, but I also want to remind some folks that another thing that we have focused on that's different from on-land excavation and damage prevention activities is, and I'm going to make a very general statement here, but usually, the on-land excavation activities, etc., are kind of daylight hours, dawn to dusk type things, normal work schedule. What you learn when you start talking to these marine construction stakeholders is their work, and Devin, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically 24/7, right? So
That's correct.
They're working, at night in inclement weather, etc. And so then you ask yourself, okay, so are my pipeline or utility crossings, are they visible at night? Are they visible in the fog? Are they visible in some of these other conditions that might otherwise be easily able to identify during the day, right? Under normal conditions. So, and another thing, and please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you read into the regulations and best practices, people see the do not anchor or dredge signs. That is actually optional. That is not required. The way I appreciate it. And please somebody call me out and say, Ed, you're full of it, and let me know where that is. But I think that is not specifically covered under a regulation. So Karen, go ahead.
We had a question come in that says, does the Army Corps use SU in planning and design phase like the FHWA? And unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the acronym FHWA. So if we have somebody from the Army Corps on that would like to speak to that, please raise your hand and I can have Levi unmute you. Otherwise, if one of our panelists are comfortable, you can take this one. So this is looking at if the Corps uses SU. And FW, thank you, Federal Highway Administration.
Yeah.
Looks like that's not one that we can answer. I'm going to jot that one down and then work to get with somebody from the Corps. Devin, if you could help me with that, we can get that question answered.
We can find the answer on that for sure.
Okay. There's another comment that says plans are only available to the pipeline companies after they have been awarded. Therefore, if any pipeline modifications are needed, it delays the project schedules for all parties. How can we obtain plans sooner? And we've been told by the USACE that they can only obtain once they are awarded.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. That is one difficult point, is that the database maintained by the Army Corps won't necessarily have the awardee, and that's just they can't necessarily update it every time. That would be a lot of work, and they don't necessarily want to tip their hand to say these companies are getting the awards. I think that's just a current limitation we have to work with. And certainly if and when the project is awarded, helping to close that feedback loops, then the operator now knows, okay, it's awarded to this party. I now can start that conversation with this dredger, but it's a current limitation, I think.
Okay. Karen, any other?
I feel that I've covered most everything in the chat. If you have entered something into the chat that you feel like I have not covered, if you would please raise your hand and I will look at the chat to find your comment. We just had another one that said, I recommend this group reaches out to ASE UESI, which is the American Society of Civil Engineers and Utility Engineering and Survey Institute. Yes, we've reached out to both Phil Meese and Ken Kerr. We tried to have them attend the pipeline task force that took place in DC. I believe it was in September. Schedules just didn't align. So that's something that I am looking forward to doing, is to having those groups speak. I know that it's either ASE or UESI is working on some underwater mapping projects. And so they have quite a few things that align with what this group is looking to do. And I think by joining forces, we can maybe expedite some of the stuff that they have going on.
And Karen, allow me to elaborate on that a little bit and, ask Devin if he wants to comment. But so I often get, well, isn't that captured? Aren't pipelines and utilities captured on navigation charts? And the answer is yes, kind of. but the accuracy of what's on there is different, because when and different utilities, pipeline, gas line, electric line, cable, whatever it is, telecom, if you're going to cross that waterway, you need some type of permit, right? And so when you go get that permit, that goes into the queue. But if a company decides not to construct that, right, it might get caught up in the queue, and you actually, folks like Devin are trying to mitigate something that's not even there. Or if it is in the queue and it does make its way from the Corps or the agency to NOAA that puts out the navigation charts and maps, I haven't got clear answers that they've actually used as-builts. So the accuracy and just using permit data is not an as-built. So, there are, many challenges that I would ask this group to empathize with these stakeholder groups, and also in your public awareness damage prevention programs. If you're a company or utility operator in enhancing damage prevention, ask yourselves in any of your education meetings, how many mariners have you invited? How many marine construction folks have you invited to attend these, right? And maybe that's a stakeholder group that needs to be focused on a little bit more, again, in light of some recent accidents over the past few years. Karen, does anybody want to come off mute? Sorry, Devin, I'll let you go. But does anybody want to come off mute and, ask some verbal questions? Devin, sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, it's fine. We're dealing with two separate problems here. And it's no one's fault. No one's placing blame on any agency. We're not pointing fingers at the Corps. We're not pointing fingers at the pipeline companies. We're trying to resolve the problem. And I think I want to make sure that message comes through clearly, because these problems were inherited from the 50s and 60s when these pipelines were first put across, and then a 80 after dredge or a survey after the pipeline was laid, it wasn't conducted. So you didn't actually know where or exactly how deep these pipelines were placed. And utilities, let's include utilities. In my career, I have hit 4 different, whether it was utility, sewer, or electrical, and fiber optic at $1,000 a second in my career. Were we calling it Miss Utility and doing our due diligence? Absolutely. But these utilities were hit because of they were not at the proper depth, and no one knew. So this is really the challenge, and at no fault to the Corps. I mean, as agency, but we're dealing with multiple government agencies, and there's no clear. So it's really, at the end of the day, until there's going to be a set tolerance zone, Sam, and that opinion comes out, it's on us to make sure that we're safe. I mean, the thousands of people of crews that are out on the water right now, and have their lives at risk. So that's really the point that we're trying to get across here.
Okay. Did we have anyone that wanted to come off mute and have a discussion before we wrap up?
I was going to say there's an ed that speaks to what you were talking about, but the coal rigs, I believe I'm saying that correctly, require specific lighting at night in periods of restricted visibility. So please note this only applies to pipelines that are floating or supported by trestles. If these pipelines become hazards to navigation, they must be marked. So I think we have a lot of good information. I think that we have a lot of representation from the different segments, and I think it's great for all of us to be able to come together and have this one conversation where we can all get kind of on the same page about things.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that people understand, how to, I know it's real easy to talk about causes. The hard part is talk about solutions. And I'd like to offer to everyone, that there is a pipeline task force. It's a joint industry. Devin and I co-chair that. Sam is a part of that. Karen, you've been to the meetings. Paco's a part of this, and reach out to Karen, reach out to Devin or myself. There is resources out there at both the CDMCS website and also on the CAMO website. We are updating best practices. We are also updating online training, right? So look for those, become more involved, but we really, our pipeline task force, our next meeting is going to be in February. And so Karen, I do want you to let folks know about that and when it's going to be. And
I will. And we do have a hand raised from
Yep.
government relations. So Levi, have you given them the ability to unmute themselves?
I have, yes.
All right. So government relations, if you would like to unmute, you could ask your question.
Hi, this is Brenda Regal with NUCA of Pennsylvania. I've been posting a lot of the SUE recommendations on here, and I also I lobby. I've lobbied for 26 years for NUCA Pennsylvania. Plus, I have 12 years experience working at the Pennsylvania legislature. So I had suggested earlier that rather than mucking up the underground 811 laws that all the states have, I'm suggesting to the group that you consider a separate 811 law just for Marine, and keep it separate. And that way you can change your tolerance zones without affecting everything else and really confusing people by trying to put it all into one law.
Okay.
yeah,
And yeah, definitely have been pushing SUE since 20 some years ago. My president at the time walked in from a CGA meeting with the Purdue study, and he told me, hang on to this, in about 20 years we'll be ready for it. So since 2019 I started a big push for that. Been working with Phil Meese and Jim Ansbach and Nick Zambellis, all SUE pioneers, and there's quite a few other ones out there as well. I don't want to miss anybody, but those are the main ones that I've been focusing with. And in 2006, Pennsylvania put SUE language in our law. We were the first in the nation to do that. And so we're really trying to push that nationwide, that let's get this done in the planning and design phase. If you really want to make a huge impact, that's the way to do it. And then Phil Meese comes along with the mapping of that data for the future, which Alvazar, I believe it is what you were talking about. That we want to make sure that our children have that stuff for the future. So those are just, when you're doing your pipeline task force, those are some of the things that I'm just suggesting to the group that you consider looking into. And there is the SUE Association as well. I'm sure they would be very happy to send somebody and talk to you about what the SUE practitioners can offer to the dredgers and the pipeline. I know I had a presentation with, I believe their acronym is SAM, and they actually had a marine project that they did in Philadelphia. And had they not done that project, they would have hit a major gas line. So it can be done.
So
Thank you.
I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. It looks like we're at time right now. So if you'd like to stay on for a few minutes, we will have that short coffee and question session to keep the conversation going. I know that some comments have come into the chat in the past few minutes. So right now, if you would, please take a moment to fill out the brief survey that Levi is going to post in the chat so that we can continue to improve these discussions and address topics that are important to you. And on behalf of everyone at IR, I would like to thank you all for joining us. A recording of this town hall will be posted on excavationsafetyalliance.com, where you'll also be able to register for next month's town hall, which will be held January 12th, and is titled, How Do You Track the True Total Cost of a Damage, Not Just the Repair Cost? Also, as we've mentioned a couple of times, please consider joining us in person in Tampa, February 14th through the 16th for the Global Excavation Safety Conference, where we'll have additional discussions and a wide variety of educational opportunities. 2 of our speakers from today will be presenting sessions. Our moderator, Ed, will be co-presenting a session titled Best Practices on Protecting Underwater Pipelines and Utilities. And Sam will be presenting a session covering the updated edition of RP 1162 and what it means for operator public awareness programs. Both Ed and Devin have alluded to the meetings that they will be hosting of both a CAMO meeting, Pipeline Task Force meeting, and a CDMCS meeting. And so I will include that information. Levi will send that out, but those will be taking place over the same dates, the February 14th through the 16th. So for first-time attendees, those meetings would not have a fee, but for first-time attendees, if you'd be looking to join us at the conference, you can take advantage of our 811 special, which is $811 for a full conference registration, which is more than 30% off of the current price. So you can do so by visiting globalexcavationsafetyconference.com. And we'll continue now for those who want to participate in the brief coffee and question section. And so for the panel, I will look and see the comments that I had missed. So Jesse, it looks like you had shared your contact information. I'm not sure. Is there someone specific that you were looking to get in touch with? Levi, if we could have it so that Jesse Torres can unmute themselves if they're still on. I'd like to make sure that we handle that. Sure.
Don't see them in the participant list.
Okay. They must have jumped off. If anybody has any other comments that they would like to talk about, otherwise I would like to thank Ed, all of our panelists, and all of you for joining us. I really appreciate it. I think it was a great conversation. Like everyone has said, we still have a ways to go, but this is the way to start moving us forward. So thank you everyone for your time.
Yep. Thank you, Karen, for helping host, and Levi as well. So I appreciate it. So thanks to everyone, and feel free, just one more plug for our Pipeline Task Force meeting in Tampa. It costs nothing. Feel free to join us and participate there. So if you need more information, just reach out to one of us, one of the panel members here, and we can get you more information. All right, Karen.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.